And deciding on how to use this time, we said, the best thing would be, if everybody had read this, the best thing would be to do Q&A. But since it's being recorded, and since many of you haven't read it yet because it was released a couple of weeks ago, we thought the best thing would be for us to go section by section and kind of talk through the most important things, although not everything. We're going to omit any conversation about commissioned pastors because that's later. And I'm sure we won't cover everything in here. So, who do you want to go first? You want me to jump in on?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, the first thing I want to say is on section 4, abbreviations and definitions. That section, it may seem to be the least important, but I am finding that in my conversations with classes clerks and with churches is that many times people get things wrong because they use the wrong terms. I just dealt with a situation in our classes where somebody says, "Oh, you're calling this pastor and we're going to give them a contract." Call and contract are two very different things. We're going to install our assistant minister. No, if you install a minister, an associate minister, because an associate minister serves under call and is installed in the local church. So even though it seems like a pain to work on definitions and to understand their meanings, these are, as I put in this first section, terms of art, meaning that they have specialized meanings. And minister being the most obvious one in the book. Whenever the book the Book of Church Order uses the word minister, it means minister of word and sacrament. Some churches say, everybody here is a minister, and use the term because obviously we want to encourage people to be serving. That's what minister means, to serve. But when we use it, it always means minister of word and sacrament. Now that's not true for the word pastor. Pastor can be used very widely. It describes anybody that's carrying on a pastoral role. And so you can have a youth pastor who's not ordained, never went to seminary. That's an okay use of the word because that's not a word that describes an office. The office is described minister of word and sacrament. That's my initial shot. Go ahead, Larry.
To follow up on that, one of the most helpful roles you can do is in any situation, bring some clarity, as he just talked about. Understanding the definitions, sharing them commonly. Understanding contracts, be sure they're clear. So the abbreviation suggests in a reminder that your role is to bring clarity into situations.
We're going to skip the section on theology because we're doing that after lunch. So we're going to go on to the next section, and I just got to figure out, I think I wrote number 6, so I'll comment on that. The role of the stated clerk, Larry and I talked about that actually quite a bit in terms of how to frame that. You may find probably the most important thing to know is that it varies a lot from classes to classes. But there are some things that you need to keep track of. And so after talking about the role of the stated clerk, it talks about classis membership as being one of the key challenges to being a clerk, is figuring out who the members of the classis are and what that word means. And believe it or not, that's been a discussion in church order of what the word member means and if we ought to include licensed candidates as members. But right now, you have members who are ministers of word and sacrament and commissioned pastors, and the elder delegates that are sent to your last classis meeting are members of the classis. And those people keep changing all the time. So that's one of the problems with being a clerk, is you got to figure out who the members are, and particularly who the voting members of classis are. Because you have your membership in the classis, which includes ministers who are without charge or retired, who are not actively serving, and therefore not voting members of classis. So I'd say one of the biggest challenges for any classis clerk is to figure out who the members are, to keep track of them, names and addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, all of that is a huge part of being a clerk.
And before you move past that page, I'm going to go under section A there, the clerk is called the stated clerk.
Yeah, explain
Now-
it, please.
This, and I'll say, this term has bothered me. That seems redundant. But it also became clear when Bill was asking a question in our new clerk thing about, you're just a clerk. What do you want? No, I'm the stated clerk, which means there's an authority that this body has given to me. It's not just a job. And so my word becomes a little more clear because that's a clearly stated role. And as we've said before in those workshops, stated clerk doesn't mean you're the designated minute taker, you're the record keeper. And so someone else can take minutes, but you're responsible for the record. You are the stated person in this room, is where that term comes in. But, generally, it's a bit redundant, and as we said later in the paragraph, well, let's just distinguish between classes clerks and regional Sunday clerks. But
Yeah, and as a stated clerk, you are an officer of the classes. And Paul Carson would love to join in here and say that officers have special fiduciary responsibilities. When you are an officer, you have responsibility to make sure that certain things are done. And if you don't do that, you can be sued. So when somebody says you shouldn't perform the responsibilities as described in the Book of Church Order, and you say, yes, I have to, that's why you elected me or chose me as the stated clerk, and if I don't do that, I can get into trouble, because the Book of Church Order says I need to do these things. And you are also the person then that has authority to send out notices, and when you send a notice or a letter, it has special meaning because it starts the clock ticking for when a person can file a complaint against an action of the classes. So that responsibility of notifying individuals of official actions of the classes, signing legal paperwork, all of that is a part of being a clerk.
Okay.
Goes on to talk about classis officers, so you are not alone. You have a president and probably a vice president, sometimes a treasurer. Then it talks about classis sessions and special sessions and the difference between the two. You should know there's a difference in quorum between a regular and special session of classis, and you only can do in special sessions of classis what you said you're going to do. No additional new business is allowed. Talks about parliamentary procedure and Robert's Rules of Order, and if you do not have a current copy of this book, you should. This is the most recent edition of Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised. You can get it on Amazon or most bookstores that aren't fully have their shelves stocked. It's the one authority on parliamentary procedure, and particularly Robert's Rules of Order. Some of you may have in your bylaws a statement that says our classes operates according to Robert's Rules of Order. Some of you don't, but even when you don't, the assumption is that unless you have declared another parliamentary authority, that you follow this book.
All right. It's one of Howard's favorite books.
Yes.
In fact, they're talking about changing the name to Howard's.
Let's go on to writing the minutes. We already talked about that, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that now. But there are various methods that people use, but you are responsible for doing that. And for those watching the video, we talked about that, so we're going to kind of skip over that section. I think we should go on to the next one, Larry, which is yours.
One section, it is important to approve minutes.
Oh, yes.
This is important to you.
Yes.
Yes, oh, yes. And the thing is, classes do this different. And we talked earlier about approving minutes and the fact that you approve them for distribution, and then many of you vote to approve the minutes at the next regular session, which could be 6 months or more from when you were. So usually classes have two kind of sets of approvals. and one of them being by either the officers or the executive committee that review the minutes right after the meeting, as soon as you've got them generated, and approve them for distribution. And then a second approval process that's given to the whole assembly. I know in our local church, we send out the minutes by email and say, hey, if you got any additions or corrections, let us know. So we get them out within a week. We expect additions or corrections to come back within a week. And essentially, they are approved by default because people had the opportunity to share any additions or corrections. But then at the next meeting, we vote formally to approve the minutes so that they're part of that. Dan?
One thing I've started doing and sending out those minutes that haven't been approved yet, that I'm just trying to get corrections on, is I'll put either a watermark or a note at the top saying, awaiting approval.
Right.
So it's known that that version is not the official approved minutes.
Right.
Okay.
We'll take questions. Go ahead.
I'm concerned that I'm in a dangerous situation. We have a classes meeting. We go through the morning session. Before we break for lunch, we have a reading and approval of the morning session journal. Then at the end of the day, we have the remainder of the journal that is read and approved, and that for us is the final approval. It does not go to executive committee. It does not wait for approval at the next classes meeting. It is said, done, I sign it, the president signs it, it's legal tender.
That's the old way that used to be done. And before you left the meeting, you had the approval of the minutes, and that was the final draft. No amendments after that. Some of you who want to take the time to do that, that's fine. But normally people distribute them and have approval later. But again, that just outlines the fact, you have to know what your process is. And whatever your process is the official way to do it. And if it's not in the minutes, it didn't happen. That's the importance of minutes. If it's not in the minutes, it did not happen. So when somebody says, yeah, well, we discussed about that, and I thought we decided, it's not in the minutes, it did not happen. Yeah.
So there's no clarity in the BCO on how that approval has to happen.
No, it's the only clarity in the Book of Church Order is that you have to take minutes and you have to submit them for review to the regional synod.
Okay, and then if our classes bylaws don't stipulate the process by which they get approved or reviewed, we probably should have that in our bylaws.
You could, or you just follow your practice consistently. Like, I'm not sure it's in our bylaws that it's approved at the next state session, but we do it consistently.
Okay.
It's approved at the next state session of classes.
Paul, do you want to come?
Well, Howard mentioned earlier that the minutes reflect actions of the classes, and that can trigger subsequent activities, including debate about whether that should have happened, disciplinary or judicial challenges, things like that. I have been tasked with reviewing minutes of some assemblies. I encourage you to be detailed about who attends and who these people are. Don't just list their names, but who they are, because that goes back to what Howard was talking about in terms of, I can't tell whether there's a quorum. And if there's not a quorum, that's not a valid meeting. And if that's not a valid meeting, then the action that's being challenged wasn't valid. So, really get into the details and explain things so that if the action of the classes is challenged in the future, you can at least say, we did it right. Maybe it was a wrong result, but we did it right. And a lot of that kind of stuff is lacking. And then one other thing is, put the name of the person who took the minutes at the end, because that way if a question does come up, you can try to flesh it out. At least you know who you're talking to.
Thank you. I want to ask you, as a regional Synod clerk, who's responsible for looking at classes minutes, what is it you're looking for, and why are you looking at this?
Well, we have a list that we give to our examiners who read the minutes. Some of them are pretty common sense, but you'll be amused by the fact that we've had minutes submitted by classes, and the name of the classes was not in the minutes anywhere to be found. So first of all, the name of the classes, whether it's a special or a stated session of the classes, obviously the date of the meeting. And then, were the members that are present listed there. I don't know if that's in our list, but we kind of, that would be one thing, a red flag if there was no list of those who were actually at the meeting. Then there's this, there's a general statement about that the minutes were an orderly something record of the meeting or something like that, which gives great latitude to the examiners to say, I read through the minutes and I have no idea what happened at that meeting. Then there might be a problem. We wouldn't want to alert the clerk to the fact that, another person outside of the classes read this and has no clue what happened. And then that they're signed, although we've kind of waived an electronic, a physical signature because people send them electronically. So these days, if we got a PDF and it has the name of the clerk on the bottom, we assume that they're signed. But in the olden days, when you had record books that you submitted in paper form, you always had to have a signature at the end. Those days, I think, at least in our classes, we aren't doing that. In our region, we aren't asking for that. I would imagine maybe some legal documents, some lawyer might say you still need a signature, but right now, unless it's if somebody asks for what happened at the meeting, and they're asking about a particular part of the meeting, you take that piece from the minutes, you put it in a letter, and then you sign your signature. That's an official notification that that happened, and that should have your signature on it. Okay. There are also lists if you're talking about minutes, again, back to Robert's Rules. Actually, Robert's Rules has a whole section, maybe actually a long section, on minutes and how they should be taken and recorded, what should be in the minutes. So if you're still asking yourself the question, how should I do that, read Robert's Rules.
In our regional synod minutes, we also required that the classes show that they did Article 7.
Yes. The annual constitutional inquiry, different than the consistorial report. The constitutional inquiry is Article 7 in the Book of Church Order, that whole list of questions. I prefer if they are submitted by the churches in our classes with the answers from every church to every question in some table form. But often there's another list of responses. Some people submit them in an Excel document. I can never read Excel documents because the boxes are too tiny. So I prefer, some kind of footnote to, if there was a no, then and their comment, that be included in a footnote rather than trying to put that in the summary table. But yes, since that's a book of church order requirement that the classes do that. That's another thing that the regional synod looks for. We also ask for, but have stopped requiring, but still strongly recommend that each set of classes minutes has what used to be published regularly in our regional synod minutes. We don't do it anymore, but all of the ministerial changes and all the church changes, and I give a list of things suggesting, and I really say it's more for you and your classes records so that annually you can go back and historically you can say, well, that's the year we received so-and-so as a minister of word and sacrament in our classes. And that's the year this person was dismissed to Illinois. So you have a historical record of those events. Now I know with keeping track of things digitally in different ways, some people have different methods of record keeping. But in the old days, that was something that was printed in the regional synod minutes, and they had all the ministerial change, not only ministerial status, but changes to churches, anything that happened, anybody that died, all of those kinds of things were printed in the regional synod minutes.
I know we've been talking about stated meeting minutes. My question's about executive committee minutes. My class has just had a big explosion about executive committee meetings, which we include for reference in our stated meeting. There were a lot of objections to the details that were included in that. One church felt that in particular very much picked on. And they were, because they needed to be. What do you do with executive committee meetings? I know when we get together as classes and or as a regional synod and review each other's, a lot of churches don't include their executive committee minutes. I have them. Mostly they get flipped over.
I'll give you my short answer and then let Larry respond. My short answer is if the executive committee took any actions that have significance, and if you acted on behalf of the classes, you made a decision that has some significance, like you approved an installation service, or you did something on behalf of the classes, yes, you need to report that to the classes. And yes, you need to keep a record of that.
And my response to you is yes, to what he said. But it's been my practice that a committee offers a report to the classes, not offers their minutes.
Correct.
So that the committee can have its own minutes and record in the stuff that the committee needs to keep track of.
Right.
But doesn't necessarily need to make that all public.
Right.
They offer a report of their work to the classes.
Can I add to that? We make our board minutes, we call it the board for our classes, available once a year for a Dropbox link. So if someone's really curious and wants to go look at them, they can go look at them, but otherwise we do twice a year board reports. Here's the highlights, here's the significant actions we took. If you want our minutes, if you want a full record, here's the link, they're publicly available, but we're not putting them in the classes agenda to kind of bait people into reading them and picking them apart. They're available for people who want to reference them for some reason, but the highlights are always included in that twice a year board report like any other committee would get.
Randy's raising another issue, which we could go a long time on, and that is when information is confidential, and whether information that's confidential in some way should be printed in minutes. The general answer is you have to be careful.
Yeah.
You have to be careful, first of all, that what you're putting in the minutes is true, not hearsay. That there's a factual basis for what you are saying. Not just, well, we heard that Joe Smith, the minister at First Church, is having an affair. That's not a good thing to put in your minutes because it's hearsay until it becomes a formal accusation and a charge. Once it becomes a charge, then you have to handle it carefully, but at least it's factually true that a charge has been submitted. Now, it may not be true that the charge is going to be eventually proved to be true, but the fact that a charge was submitted is true. So you have to be careful about that, and also you have to be careful about things that are said in meetings that may not be true. There's an interesting piece in this book about qualified privilege and statements that are made in the course of a business meeting by another member may considered to be defamatory. And the thing is about this, if you have something that's said that's not true, and you have non-members even if you say, even if there's something that's said that's true or has some kind of factual basis, you have non-members in the meeting, that can be considered to be sharing information that was inappropriate to share with the general public. So whenever you expect to be in a situation where your classis is going to be discussing very sensitive matters, you want to go into executive session to make sure that all the things that are said only to the members and not to non-members. Because if you begin to release things to non-members of your classes that could be challenged as being somehow defamatory, then you could get into trouble.
Okay, we are at break time.
We're at break time and we're not due. So we have already talked to Carrie, or Carrie talked to us about the next section. We're going to be talking about how to support one another, and particularly whether it's going to be helpful to form some kind of mentoring or small groups. We're going to give time for that discussion, but it's already said that maybe we could use part of his time to complete this. So I suggest we take a break and then continue after the break, unless somebody's got a better idea. Okay?
Go back at 10:45. 10:45.
Hey, bud, what's up?
Your judicial challenges, things like that. I have been tasked with reviewing minutes of some assemblies. I encourage you to be detailed about who attends and who these people are. Don't just list their names, but who they are, because that goes back to what Howard was talking about in terms of, I can't tell whether there's a quorum. And if there's not a quorum, that's not a valid meeting. And if that's not a valid meeting, then the action that's being challenged wasn't valid. So, really get into the details and explain things so that if the action of the classis is challenged in the future, you can at least say, we did it right. Maybe it was a wrong result, but we did it right. And a lot of that kind of stuff is lacking. And then one other thing is, put the name of the person who took the minutes at the end, because that way if a question does come up, you can try to flesh it out. At least you know who you were talking to.
Thank you. I want to ask you, as a regional Synod clerk, who's responsible for looking at classes minutes, what is it you're looking for, and why are you looking at this?
Well, we have a list that we give to our examiners who read the minutes. Some of them are pretty common sense, but you'll be amused by the fact that we've had minutes that's submitted by a classis, and the name of the classis was not on the minutes anywhere to be found. So first of all, the name of the classis, whether it's a special or stated session of the classis, obviously the date of the meeting, and then, were the members that are present listed there. I don't know if that's in our list, but we kind of, that would be one thing, a red flag if there was no list of those who were actually at the meeting. Then there's this, there's a general statement about that the minutes were an orderly something record of the meeting or something like that, which gives great latitude to the examiners to say, I read through the minutes and I have no idea what happened at that meeting. Then there might be a problem. We wouldn't want to alert the clerk to the fact that, another person outside of the class has read this and has no clue what happened. And then that they're signed, although we've kind of waived an electronic physical signature because people send them electronically. So these days, if we got a PDF and it has the name of the clerk on the bottom, we assume that they're signed. But in the olden days, when you had record books that you submitted in paper form, you always had to have a signature at the end. Those days, I think, at least in our classes, we aren't doing that. In our region, we aren't asking for that. I would imagine maybe some legal documents, some lawyer might say you still need a signature, but right now, unless it's if somebody asks for what happened at the meeting, and they're asking about a particular part of the meeting, you take that piece from the minutes, you put it in a letter, and then you sign your signature. That's an official notification that happened, and that should have your signature on it. Okay. There are also lists if you're talking about minutes, again, back to Robert's Rules. Actually, Robert's Rules has a whole section, maybe actually a long section, on minutes and how they should be taken and recorded, what should be in the minutes. So if you're still asking yourself the question, how should I do that, read Robert's Rules.
In our regional Synod minutes, we also require that the classes show that they did Article 7.
Yes. The annual constitutional inquiry, different than the consistorial report. The constitutional inquiry is Article 7 in the Book of Church Order, that whole list of questions. I prefer if they are submitted by the churches in our classes with the answers from every church to every question in some table form. But often there's another list of responses. Some people submit them in an Excel document. I can never read Excel documents because the boxes are too tiny. So I prefer, some kind of footnote to, if there was a no, then and their comment, that be included in a footnote rather than trying to put that in the summary table. But yes, since that's a book of church order requirement, that the classes do that. That's another thing that the Regional Synod looks for. We also ask for, but have stopped requiring, but still strongly recommend that each set of classes minutes has what used to be published regularly in our Regional Synod minutes. We don't do it anymore, but all of the ministerial changes and all the church changes, and I give a list of things suggesting, and I really say it's more for you and your classes records so that annually you can go back and historically you can say, well, that's the year we received so-and-so as a minister of word and sacrament in our classes. And that's the year this person was dismissed to Illinois. So you have a historical record of those events. Now I know with keeping track of things digitally in different ways, some people have different methods of record keeping. But in the old days, that was something that was printed in the Regional Synod minutes, and they had all the ministerial change, not only ministerial status, but changes to churches, anything that happened, anybody that died, all of those kinds of things were printed in the Regional Synod minutes.
I know we've been talking about stated meeting minutes. My question's about executive committee minutes. My class has just had a big explosion about executive committee meetings, which we include for reference in our stated meeting. There were a lot of objections to the details that were included in that. One church felt in particular very much picked on. And they were, because they needed to be. What do you do with executive committee meetings? I know when we get together as classes and or as a regional synod and review each other's, a lot of churches don't include their executive committee minutes. I have them. Mostly they get flipped over.
I'll give you my short answer and then let Larry respond. My short answer is if the executive committee took any actions that have significance, and if you acted on behalf of the classes, you made a decision that has some significance, like you approved an installation service or you did something on behalf of the classes, yes, you need to report that to the classes. And yes, you need to keep a record of that.
And my response to you is yes, to what he said. But it's been my practice that a committee offers a report to the classes, not offers their minutes.
Right. Correct.
So that the committee can have its own minutes and record in the stuff that the committee needs to keep track of.
Right.
But doesn't necessarily need to make that all public.
Right.
They offer a report of their work to the classes.
Can I add to that? We make our board minutes, we call it the board for our classes, available once a year for a Dropbox link. So if someone's really curious and wants to go look at them, they can go look at them, but otherwise we do twice a year board reports. Here's the highlights, here's the significant actions we took. If you want our minutes, if you want a full record, here's the link, they're publicly available, but we're not putting them in the classes agenda to kind of bait people into reading them and picking them apart. They're available for people who want to reference them for some reason, but the highlights are always included in that twice a year board report like any other committee would get.
Randy's raising another issue, which we could go a long time on, and that is when information is confidential and whether information that's confidential in some way should be printed in minutes. The general answer is you have to be careful. Yeah. You have to be careful, first of all, that what you're putting in the minutes is true, not hearsay. That there's a factual basis for what you are saying. Not just, well, we heard that Joe Smith, the minister at First Church, is having an affair. That's not a good thing to put in your minutes because it's hearsay until it becomes a formal accusation and a charge. Once it becomes a charge, then you have to handle it carefully, but at least it's factually true that a charge has been submitted. Now, it may not be true that the charge is going to be eventually proved to be true, but the fact that a charge was submitted is true. though, so you have to be careful about that. And also, you have to be careful about things that are said in meetings that may not be true. There's an interesting piece in this book about qualified privilege and statements that are made in the course of a business meeting by another member may considered to be defamatory. And the thing is about this, if you have something that's said that's not true, and you have non-members in, well, even if you say, even if there's something that's said that's true or has some kind of factual basis, you have non-members in the meeting, that can be considered to be sharing information that was inappropriate to share with the general public. So whenever you expect to be in a situation where your classis is going to be discussing very sensitive matters, you want to go into executive session to make sure that all the things that are said only to the members and not to non-members. Because if you begin to release things to non-members of your classes that could be challenged as being somehow defamatory, then you could get into trouble. The way we ended the last one is a good illustration of what we probably shouldn't do, is go down too many rabbit trails. Because as soon as you start talking about one topic, you can talk about it for a long time. The manual has actually got the opposite goal, is to try to introduce you to the basics. What are the things that you need to do? It's still 60 pages, but it's an attempt to keep things on a fairly general level. If you're asking very specific questions, like how to give a negative reference, I got an email of that recently, is how do you make a negative reference? And I really actually sort of referred them to Paul, because I said, you're treading on really difficult territory when you get to this kind of situation. Yeah, Paul?
That Paul.
And that's a specific topic tomorrow, so.
Come tomorrow, yes.
I'm even bringing handouts.
Oh.
Paper.
Yeah. So you know how to, that's not in the manual currently, and maybe it needs to be. So you can help us say, well, that's important enough that we have to have it in the manual. What this is trying to do is to cover things in general so that if you are a new clerk, you have a pretty good idea of what's most important. And Larry's going to take the next one.
All right. And introduce us by this, what Howard didn't tell you about the regional synod clerks getting together under him. He provides lunch.
Good tip.
That's why they come.
Sure.
That's right.
Yeah. Wait a second. Ed is out of the room with that information. It's wrong. It's recording. Okay.
I'm picking up on page 18, which is the supervision of local and organizing churches. It was referred to, mentioned earlier about the constitutional inquiry. That's what that section is called in Article 7. A copy of that is in the appendix. There are several ways to do that. You can just simply ask questions and get a yes or no response. We've done that for a number of years, and then our committee in our classes that reviews that says, we'd like more information. Why are they answering yes or no? And so we started asking them to share some paragraphs, and it's become a fun thing to look at and to read. You already had the constitutional report form done, and so I'm not going to talk about that. Move on to minutes of consistories and elder boards. The classis is required to read the minutes. Now, you know, in one respect, we've collected minutes from all of our churches and set them on the table. And we used to look at jot and tittle. Well, what else are you going to look at? Did you open prayer? Did you close with prayer? Did you approve minutes? Did you not? Did you sign it? And we moved it from, that was our judicial committee, we moved it to our church support and supervision committee, and then they began to read them to understand what's going on in a church. And I certainly want to encourage you to do that. It's a wonderful way to find out what's going on within the church, and to know what they're doing and what they're talking about. To see that as a way of providing supervision, not simply yes or no responses. Classes supervisor. A few years ago, the process changed that the classes defines what it is the supervisor is to do within a church. And so this opens up the opportunity for each classes to develop a policy and procedure, and for those who are providing oversight, who are assigning the supervisor, to give that supervisor some specific task in which they can accomplish, to recognize that situations are different within each church and what is needed. And rather than saying this is how it's done, to say how do you want it done? On the Clerks website, again, you look in different classes. You've been very helpful in providing some documents for how you've used church supervisors, so certainly take a look at that. A big thing, as I turn to page 20, is to look at approval of calls. And number 3, there's a worksheet that's very helpful that we certainly have used. We try to ask the questions. What, have you addressed this? Have you addressed this? How have you done this? And there's a way to, that the calls and contracts, and that's one of the important roles with, again, with a clerk, is that you're providing clarity. If you read a contract and you don't get it, or you say, well, what are you going to do about this? Ask those questions. Because those are the questions that invariably come up. The ones that we didn't ask are the ones, the issues that arise, it seems, in contract and call relationships. So read through those documents and
That's a good point, that it's not just the math. I mean, you're doing the math to figure out whether the call or contract meets the compensation guidelines. That's the worksheet. But asking the other questions about what it is that we want to do to help, first of all, be confident that this person is going to serve the church well. So is there going to be an interview process? In our classes, we say any person who's going to serve as a lead or solo pastor is interviewed by a team from the classes. I know there's some other classes that have actually an orientation session for those who are coming into the classes, especially from another classes. So they have a process that they go through as a part of the approval of the call. It's not optional. It's a part of the approval call. You will go through this process. So when you think about approval of calls and contracts, you have to say, what is it that we want to accomplish and what are we going to do? We have separate teams in our classes. We have a call and contract approval team that just looks at the math, because the math is complicated enough, even with the Bob's document on retirement and insurance, it's still complicated. So having one team that just looks at the numbers and then another team look at the individual and say, you know, what do we need to know about this individual before they become a member of the classes, and then what do we need to help that individual once they accept the call. And we also have within our classes, anybody that's new to the classes is assigned a coach or a mentor for a year. So that's all that part of that process of how do you bring somebody into the classes that another team would look at.
And one of those picks up, again, you get the explanation about the EPBH that's there. I really respect our denomination for that. They developed a process that says we care about all ministers wherever they're serving. And we're going to see that they all have a fair retirement account. And that's a hallmark in our denomination that we should all be proud of how people work to develop that one. But then when it comes time for waivers, that they're required to contribute to some of these, and sometimes When it gets a time, and you can say, well, you know, that person really doesn't need that. And so we're, again, creating clarity by a waiver to say, we all understand that this does not need to be paid. And we're letting the denomination know, we're letting the classes know, and the person know.
And just in the last week, read through that section in the Book of Church Order again very carefully, because we have a church in our classes that wants to employ a full-time pastor under contract, but wants to provide, doesn't want to provide them with the RCA retirement plan. They want to provide an alternate plan. And I just gave my response to that was this: it is possible to have a waiver for somebody who's working part-time, but the Book of Church Order says part-time under special circumstances. It doesn't say, because it says part-time, it means excludes full-time. So I went back to the church and I said, you need to provide the 11% or the EBPH number for this individual, because this is an ordained minister who's working full-time in the classes. I didn't give them the threat. If they write back and push back, the threat is, and this has happened, so for new clerks especially, it is possible for a minister who's not been given that 11% retirement to sue the classes and the church after they leave, and they will get that money from you. Because it says in the book, they are guaranteed retirement payments, and it's in the Book of Church Order. It's not a classes policy or even in the compensation guidelines that are approved by the class. It's in the Book of Church Order that that's what they're going to get. So if you say to a church, oh, that doesn't really matter, just make sure you have a little escrow account to cover that later. Because it's very possible, especially if the minister ends up, one case, minister was riding out a church that was in decline and less money available for retirement payments. So the church closed eventually, and the minister said to the classes, I have a lawyer and I want a big chunk of the sale of that property. And the classes said, talked to their lawyer and said, of course, we'll pay you all of the retirement, into your retirement fund, everything that you weren't paid, because they knew they were going to lose that in court. Right. Settle out of court. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Make sure on that waiver the spouse is also on board.
Yes.
Because if the spouse is unaware, that gets tricky too, and there can be legal ramifications there. So on those waivers, on those documents, make sure the spouse is lived in, because situation of divorce, those retirement contributions are usually divided 50-50. That spouse has the right to half of that money. If that money was never put in, you also have a problem there. So make sure on those waivers, spouses are included.
Good thing.
And along with that, another thing came out of our clerks gathering is how to end contracts and end calls, that we get a confirmation from the minister. The minister understands that all that the minister was to receive has been paid to that minister. And also, the consistory signs that they understand all has been paid, but if it later discovers that it hasn't been paid, they will pay that. To have, again, that clarity of how a relationship ends, and that there's not dangling questions that are taking place. Organizing new churches, merging churches. It's always fun and interesting, and a greater topic than what we're going to have time for here. Except to say, in recent years, the Book of Church Order has changed to allow a church that's not organized to begin operating as if it, somewhat as if it is. And that is that the classes would appoint a governing board. So it's a classes approved governing board. It's assumed in that it begins with a number of classes folks, and by the time they get organized, it has mostly been, the roles have been assumed by church members. But having that recognized governing board, that governing board can hold membership. So the classes shouldn't hold membership. We have a governing board that holds that kind of membership as the church begins to build its body and its life. And also, the Booker Charter allows someone from that governing board to be a delegate to the classes, a voting delegate. And that was working through with church multiplication. What we're trying to do is to normalize the process of what it means to be a Reformed church from the start of the church. Rather than having this church build for a few years, say, okay, now you're going to have to send delegates and do all the other stuff like churches do. And they say, I'm sorry, we haven't been doing that for years. Why do we do it now? Again, as I said, the idea is to normalize the process as the church is forming. So this is in place when it happens. And of course, Formulary 15, and we'll let Paul talk about that, is one of his favorite topics. But change forms are always needed. Superseding a consistory. I moved on to a whole nother page. Again, the Commission on Church Order has worked to clarify what that process is. Because the questions came through, when is a 2/3 vote required? Some could have interpreted the Book of Church Order that every time a change has been made, that the classis needs to vote with a 2/3 majority. And to clarify that it takes a 2/3 majority to take the action to supersede, and a 2/3 majority to reinstall the consistory, move out of the supersession process. Otherwise, what's happening within that is the action of the classis. It doesn't require that kind of supermajority in order to act. So in other words, the supersession team, a member changes. No, that doesn't require 2/3 of the classis to vote approval to change a member of the body. It's already been approved that the body's established. And so, again, trying to make sure the process is clear and my mouth wants to say the word simple and my brain says don't say that.
Voting is not even simple, because it says the decision to supersede requires a 2/3 vote at a stated session or special session where a quorum is present, meeting the requirements of a quorum of a stated session. So in other words, you might as well call it a stated session, even if it is a special session, because you have to have the same quorum. And then the vote is 2/3. I misread that once and gave somebody some bad advice. It doesn't say 2/3 of the members present, it says 2/3 of vote. So that means that there are a whole bunch of abstentions, you only count the yes or no votes. You know, and that makes a whole lot of difference than if it's 2/3 of the members present, because abstentions then are not counted. You need 2/3 of the people present and voting. Yeah.
So that precludes an executive committee acting on the behalf of classes between stated sessions of doing anything to this hill.
Correct. You cannot do that. Somebody will file a complaint and they'll win on appeal.
So I just worked, so we superseded a congregation over the last 2 years. And at our last meeting last week, we lifted supersession. But we had to take a lot of processing to figure out how do we do that? What has to come first? What does the congregation need to decide in their elections, nomination and elections? How does the classis approve that? When do those elections happen? Then how does the classis approve that slate? And like we played all that out and we figured it out on what we felt worked for us.
Yes.
But I mean, I emailed Dan, I emailed Aaron, a few others, of just saying, help me figure out if this is the right order. And I felt like it worked. Nobody questioned it in the classes. But had I had that ahead of time, it would have helped. It would have saved hours for us. So the whole reconstituting of the consistory, that process, that could be fleshed out a little bit more.
Yeah. Thank you for working on that. Website. So the rest of us have that, okay?
Yes.
And really, that's that would be the process in which you'd want to have that happen, is for the Book of Church Order saying it takes 2/3 majority. How you get the process there can vary from the churches, and therefore, having, as I said before, it's always helpful to start with something rather than to start with nothing.
Right.
And someone say, we need to adapt your process, but at least we've got something, so you'd be helpful to all of us to submit that.
Regional Synod Judicial Business Committee will be much more sympathetic if you can show that you've thought through the process. Even if you screwed up someplace, you thought through a process, you had something that was fair, that allowed everybody to have their voice. Boy, does that help when you have something that's on appeal to one of the regional synod or general synod, to have all that paperwork, you've got it documented what you did.
Okay, so.
Rodney, go ahead.
The BCO says when you're superseding consistory that the formal organization of the church is sort of ended or put, I mean, I'm looking for the language here. It says that, so as far as, otherwise terminate the formal organization of that church and take such steps to bring the church under it and its ministry under the classis. How does that affect the CRF reporting? Because if they're not an organized congregation anymore, then in some sense, they're not required to do the CRF.
Correct.
And then how that works as far as the paying of assessments, because that's a lag from a year or more previous. So it seems to me like if you're superseding either by the request of the congregation or because you anticipate the disbanding, like that makes some sense. But if you're superseding because some naughtiness happened and you're anticipating bringing them back on, like how do we work that out as far as CRF reporting goes?
Be very careful about, there's three different things we're talking about. One is superseding, which
Right.
actually the church continues to be organized. It's just the consistory's been superseded.
Okay.
One is the dissolution of the congregation in terms of its formal organization. So it's no longer doing what a congregation does. It no longer meets for worship, but the corporation is still intact.
Right.
And then the third piece is you get rid of the corporation. And that's the last thing you want to do. You want to keep that corporation as long as you can.
Right.
Because that's what entitles you to, sell property and, track all the other kinds of legal things that have to be done.
So-
And Paul put a great piece, or before, I think it's on the Clerks website, of tracking this whole process of going through the dissolution of a congregation. I think it was your piece. Somebody did it. Maybe, I'm giving you the credit.
And I think that's on the list tomorrow also.
Okay, it's on the list tomorrow? Okay, good.
So that makes sense to me, but the wording under the section for superseding the consistory is confusing then, because under section 2, part D, it says that, part C, it says that if the classis, after having heard the consistory, continues in its intention, it shall dissolve the consistory and otherwise terminate the formal organization of that church.
Well, there's steps there, so yes, but I'd say that you got to get all the ducks in a row.
Right.
So the consistory is the formalized body of the church.
The organizing.
They are the trustees,
Correct.
Great.
okay? So all the property decisions
Yep.
come to that new group,
Yep.
that two-procession group. That's what it's really talking about, is that supersession team now takes over the authority that the consistory had. The church
Okay,
is
so it's
still-
an organized congregation, but the formal organization is not considered the same language as being an organized congregation. Because that's like funky language in the
An
sense
organized
of what
congregation.
formal organization is versus, because we're organizing a new congregation coming up in July, and part of that liturgy is to install to elect and install the elders and deacons. So when the classis kind of has that role, it's still an organized church, even though it doesn't have a formal organization.
But it does.
It does have, and it's a supersession team, yes. They
The
are
language in the
replacing
BCO
Yeah,
is
it's
confusing, is
confusing.
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Paul wanted to comment. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I'll just keep going with his thought, and then I'll weigh in with.
Okay. I think for me, it's separate votes. They could all happen in the same meeting. You could vote to supersede and dissolve, same meeting, but I think they're separate votes. And they could be separated in time.
And
So
that-
you could have one vote at classis meeting to supersede, and then in the next classis meeting, vote to dissolve the congregation.
And that leads to what I was going to say, and that is that if in my conversations with people, I talk in terms of disbanding the church, dissolving the corporation.
Okay.
You know, you're dealing with two separate things here. You're talking about a polity and order kind of thing on the one hand, you may have a corporate thing on the other hand. So.
Again,
keep that
terms are
distinction in
important.
mind. And the other, pardon me?
Terms are important.
Yeah.
And I like it, disbanding the church, dissolving the corporation.
And unfortunately, it talks about dissolving the consistory.
Oh,
Okay, and that's where I'm getting, but
You should-
but
That's
bear
the
in mind
language
that
in BCO.
even if you dissolve the consistory, you have not affected the existence of the corporation.
correct.
You simply altered its leadership. So the corporate entity continues, it just has different leaders, but ultimately, if you're not able to right the ship and get the church back on track and you go in the other direction, you would dissolve the corporation, which is a separate
Separate action.
matter, and yeah.
So again, these could be compressed into one meeting, which I wouldn't advise, or stretched out over a fairly long period of time, depending on what the situation is.
So the issue that I'm wondering about though is the corporation is not necessarily within our polity, because you can have articles of incorporation or you cannot, because you can come under the large heading of the RCA without those articles of incorporation.
They were
that's a
talking about two
state-
different animals, yeah.
That's a state kind of thing, not necessarily an RCA polity kind of thing. I don't know, I'm confused and maybe wasting our time. It just,
I'd be happy to devote part of my conversation tomorrow to Rodney raising these questions
Great.
with me. Okay?
And this is another great example of how you take something that's general in format, and if you run down the rabbit trail, you can end up with all kinds of other questions that no one has ever thought of before. Or maybe somebody has, but it's not written down anywhere. It's not on the clerk's website. So that's when you start asking people, and maybe some senior members of the State of Clerks group, have you ever run into this? Let's think about it. And sometimes Paul and I have had conversations where we've gone on with an email thread for a while before we kind of came up with an answer that seemed, that came up with an answer that seemed reasonable to both of us. It takes a while sometimes to get there.